New York was in its winter rhythm, a city of steam plumes and hurried scarves. At LaGuardia, the glare of a low January sun washed over the icy tarmac as U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320-214, prepared for a routine hop to Charlotte. The call sign would be Cactus 1549, the inherited cadence from the company's America West lineage, but for the 150 passengers and 5 crew, it was simply a quick flight home or a connection onward. Up front, First Officer Jeff Skiles, newly qualified on the A320, would fly the departure. Captain Chesley, Sully Sullenberger, former Air Force fighter pilot, glider pilot, and safety expert, handled the radios and oversight. He had the even, unhurried tone of someone who had seen both the predictable and the unimaginable in aviation and who had learned to trust checklists as much as human judgment. In the cabin, 3 flight attendants, Donna Dent, Sheila Dail, and Doreen Welsh, performed the choreography so familiar it could be done with eyes closed, doors armed, demo complete, carts latched, smiles measured but sincere. It was a day to believe in routine. Passengers slid bags into overheads, negotiated armrests, and texted the last message before airplane mode. A businessman memorized bullet points for a meeting in Charlotte. A young mother juggled a stroller and a toddler's snack-sized emergencies. A retired couple planned how they would reminisce with friends over dinner once they connected south. Each seat held its own small biography and private stakes. No one had reason to know that 10 minutes later their names would be threaded together in headlines around the world. Pushback, start, taxi. The A320 taxied toward runway 4. The cabin hummed with the soft white noise of air conditioning and the occasional cough of winter. Outside, the East River and the Harlem skyline crouched under the cold. The final checklist ticked off smoothly, and with the steady thrust of 2 CFM56 engines, the aircraft accelerated, lifted, and became a story in the sky. Sullenberger listened for the expected rhythm of a departure, while his eyes ran an old, practiced scan. Skiles followed the departure profile precisely. Positive rate, gear up, a turn, a climb through a clear blue cold. The airplane was light and responsive. The kind of day where a pilot might briefly think, "This is why I do this," an airplane obeying hands and intention like a well-tuned instrument. In the rows behind, the cabin settled into a quiet equilibrium. The seatbelt sign glowed. Overhead, bins held their peace. Donna, Sheila, and Doreen traded a few words in the galley that only those who live in galleys know by heart. Tiny jokes clipped short by duty. They could not see what had already begun above the Bronx and the Harlem River. A dark, shifting congregation of Canada geese pushing south, heavy and unhurried, their migration cutting across the invisible paths of metal. Aviation lives on layers: procedure, physics, chance. The story of Flight 1549 would be written on all 3, but mostly on a 4th, the human. In a handful of seconds, the routines of an entire industry would narrow to one cockpit, one decision, and one river running like a steel blue runway at the heart of Manhattan. Air traffic control voice in the headset, clear, clipped, ordinary. Cactus 1549, contact departure. The A320 climbed through a few thousand feet, turning toward the south. Ahead, the pale winter sky made promises it could not keep. Then impact. It began with sound, a fast, percussive thud-thud-thud against composite and titanium, as if hailstones had been hurled by a furious god. Feathers, bodies, a sudden peppering of organic shrapnel across the cockpit windscreen. The left engine coughed, swallowed air that was no longer only air, and the right engine tried to do the same. In a heartbeat, the airplane lurched as both CFM56 surged and then wound down into a low, terrible whine. The steady push of thrust, the invisible river that keeps wings an honest distance above ground, collapsed. "You got the airplane," Skiles said by training and instinct. Control was transferred as cleanly as a baton. "My aircraft," Sullenberger confirmed, voice even. Behind the calm words, years of discipline snapped to attention. The engine instruments told the tale in cold numbers. The window told it in a smear of feathers and a smell like scorched poultry riding the pressurized air. In the cabin, the jolt was felt as a shiver through seat tracks and a quick drop in stomachs, the kind that makes conversations stutter and eyes search for flight attendants' faces. Donna, Sheila, and Doreen stood a fraction taller without moving. Their training, brace commands, door assessments, the geography of exits unfurled in the mind faster than words. Cactus 1549, we've lost thrust on both engines, Sullenberger transmitted. The sentence was clinical, almost quiet, but to those who spoke the language of flying, it was an alarm bell. Dual-engine failure after takeoff is a phrase pilots rehearse in simulators the way firefighters rehearse flames. In real life, it is merciless in its compression of time. Altitude bleeding, options shrinking. Skiles reached for the quick reference handbook, the thick binder of abnormal and emergency procedures that pilots know like a liturgy. He began the memory items for dual-engine failure: airspeed, APU, ignition. The checklists are designed for order under pressure. They are lifelines made of paper and habit. But no checklist, however well written, can declare a landing site. That is judgment's realm. Ahead, the geometry of New York presented choices. To the left, LaGuardia. To the right, Teterboro. Its runway 1 pointed like an arrow north. Straight ahead and below, the Hudson River unspooled wide and cold between Manhattan and New Jersey. A liquid runway defined by current and chance. Air traffic control offered vectors, runways, numbers. The airplane offered gravity. In the thin, bright air of 3,000 feet, it came down to seconds and thousands of small, disciplined movements. Pitch for best glide, bank for headings, start the APU early to save systems that would otherwise die with the engines. And then, in the quiet where turbines should scream, a single premise took shape in the captain's mind. No runway was truly within reach. The cockpit was a studio of compressed time. The APU engaged, electrical power stabilized, and with it, the hydraulics that translate pilot intent into movable surfaces. Skiles, head down in the QRH, moved with the metronome of training. Restart attempts, fuel switches, ignition. Sullenberger, eyes outside then back in, ran a mental map against the vanishing altitude. LaGuardia towered in the pilot's mind as a promise and a trap. To turn back with insufficient altitude is to draw a deadly arc toward hard concrete and buildings. Simulators can show a mathematically perfect return if the decision is instantaneous and flawless. Human life happens with diagnosis time, with real risks and real fear. Teterboro's runway 1 gleamed like an invitation. ATC could deliver them there if lift and time could be bought. But the glide numbers and angles spoke a colder language. "I don't think we can make any runway," Sullenberger said, almost as if to himself and to the recorders that hear what humans say when steel is honest. He keyed the mic. Calm. "We're going to be in the Hudson. There are sentences that end arguments." This was one. It was not bravado, not resignation. It was the decision to trade concrete for water, buildings for ferries, speed for survivable deceleration. It was a wager on New York's maritime spine, on crew resource management, on a river's wide forgiveness compared to a city's sharp edges. The decision carried immediate corollaries. The nose had to be held precisely at the edge where lift fights drag. The speed managed to a narrow window. Too fast, and the river would tear the airplane apart. Too slow, and the wing would stall, dropping a wingtip and spinning disaster. The landing gear would remain up to prevent the nose from biting and flipping. Flaps would be selected for maximum lift at minimum penalty. In the cabin, 3 professionals felt the decision as a change in energy. They could not hear the sentence about the Hudson, but they recognized the choreography of an imminent emergency landing. They moved to their positions and prepared to become voices that would cut through panic with simple imperatives. Behind them, 150 people absorbed the wordless message and did what humans do. grabbed hands, stared at screens, whispered prayers, fixed their eyes on tiny symbols that meant exit. ATC offered headings and numbers to the last. They were doing what controllers do, build escape routes with words, but the airplane had already turned into the Hudson's center line, southbound. Sullenberger lowered the nose a touch to hold speed and aimed for a stretch of water, clear of boats, avoiding bridges and piers. He had flown fighters and gliders. He knew what air over wing feels like when it's right and when it's lying. Now, he would borrow from all of it. The decision would be debated later in calmer rooms with data and hindsight. In the moment, it was not a debate. It was a pilot's job distilled to its essence. Aviate, navigate, communicate, save lives. He would give his city a sight it had not seen, a narrow-bodied jet sliding onto a river as if it were a runway that had always been there. And he would do it without killing the people who had trusted him with their ordinary Thursday plans. The 3 words repeated, sharp and rhythmic, were a bridge between fear and action. Brace, brace, brace. Heads down, stay down. In the following testimonies, many passengers would say that the clarity of those commands saved them from the paralysis of dread. It gave them a job: tuck, hold, protect. Flight attendants are the last calm voices humans hear before metal meets earth, or in this case, water. Donna, Sheila, and Doreen ran their mental checklists at speed. Doors to be assessed, slides that would become rafts, the hazards of opening an exit below the waterline. They scanned the cabin for the signs that would matter in seconds: able-bodied passengers near exits, infants to be shielded, the aisle's path to the doors. Their mouths formed the words again, because cadence makes courage contagious. Passengers took positions like a choreography they learned in 10 seconds, foreheads to seatbacks, forearms crossed to protect. Some whispered to God in accents from across America and beyond. A few managed a text, "I love you." Others could not move their thumbs for the shaking. A man on the left window seat stared down at the Hudson and thought absurdly of photographs he'd seen of seaplanes in magazines. A woman counted her breaths, 5 in, 5 out. Somewhere someone laughed once, a reflex of terror's strange humor, then fell silent. In the cockpit, the final setup crystallized. Flaps set, speed trimmed. The nose traced its descent across the steely river, a careful, shallow path. The George Washington Bridge slid behind them like a metal crown left in the cold. Skiles kept calling out airspeeds and check items, his voice metronomic, the QRH, a tether to an ordered world. The cabin lights, the fabric, the overhead symbols, these became the universe for 155 people. The first rows braced against a bulkhead where the galley hummed moments before. In the back, water would be closer when it came. Doreen, in the aft, felt the tail's language in her bones. She knew what a hard touchdown would do back there, and how quickly cold could turn from shock to hazard. Brace, brace, brace. The words braided the cabin into a single intention. A child cried once, and then was quieted by a stranger's hand. Eye contact became its own kind of lifeline. The physics would be merciless. The humans would meet it with posture and discipline. Ahead, barges and ferries moved on their own business, captains glancing up to a shape that did not belong, realizing with a mix of disbelief and maritime instinct what was about to happen. Already hands reached for radios, already throttles were nudged, already men and women in thick coats turned their bows toward the descending Airbus. The city, long accused of being hard, prepared to be soft. Brace! Contact! The river received the airplane with a violence moderated by skill. The main fuselage struck first. Tail low, nose high, skimming rather than stabbing, trading kinetic energy for a long hiss of water and a rising veil of spray. Inside, belts cut into hips and shoulders. The human body learned in a fraction how many forces it could withstand. Overhead bins sprang their latches and spewed a few belongings. In the aft, a seam would give and let the river in with a vengeance, shocking and cold. For a heartbeat, the Airbus was both boat and rock. Then miraculously it held. The nose settled without digging, the wings remained level, the slide rafts were still packed potential. The river, 40 front negative and unforgiving, slapped against aluminum and asked for tribute. Inside, the first task was not celebration, but assessment. Are the exits above the waterline? Is there fire? Is there smoke? Do the doors armed for slides have a chance to inflate in this wind? The cockpit was suddenly a space of stillness, the way a stage is quiet before applause. Sullenberger set the parking brake, a gesture as much for order as for utility, and made a cabin announcement that would be remembered for its simplicity. The words were few. The meaning was vast. Evacuate. In the back, Doreen confronted the brutal speed of cold water as it surged through a rupture and wrapped her legs in icy weight. She fought the door, balanced the calculus of opening or not, and battled a pain that would later require stitches. Up front, Donna and Sheila cracked open their exits, the first gales of winter air bursting in, the slides inflating and unfurling into rafts that slapped the river's skin alive. Passengers rose from braced positions into a new kind of urgency. The aisle jammed not with panic, but with physics. Humans take up space. Some clung to the etiquette of order. Others moved with a primal economy that ignored everything but light and exit. Shoes were lost, coats grabbed or forgotten, bags largely left behind in a collective obedience to training's plea. Leave belongings. Then came the image that would circle the world. Human beings standing on the wings of a jet. A line of winter coats and hats along the silver span, steam rising from mouths, arms wrapped around torsos, water licking at ankles. The rafts filled fast. The wings took bodies. The doors became gates between heat and hypothermia. The airplane, a thing not meant to float, did so long enough for the city to arrive. The Hudson in January is not a place for long contemplation. Cold is not a sensation there, it is a predator. Within minutes, ferries and boats converged. NY waterway captains pivoted toward the stationary aircraft with the reflex born of decades on that water. Deckhands threw life rings that arced orange against grey. Ladders clanged down. Orders were shouted over engine rumble and wind. Passengers learned the physics of survival anew. Hold the rope, step onto the ladder, trust the hands that reach. Some were lifted bodily over railings by strangers whose names they might never know. Others shuffled along the leading edge of a wing toward a raft, testing each step for purchase in a sheet of increasing ice and spill. In the rafts, the flight attendants became both shepherds and shields. They counted heads with eyes that refused to miss, redistributed weight with a word and a gesture, wrapped foil blankets around shaking shoulders, barked at the instinct to stand. A raft is a small democracy. Panic can topple it. Calm is a decision. They enforced it. On the wings, time elongated into a sequence of breaths and shivers. A man stared down the length of aluminum and thought of every time he had ignored a safety briefing. A woman clutched the hand of a stranger and began to list out loud the names of her children as if the recitation itself built warmth. The river lapped and then bit. Rescue boats nosed closer, their propellers churning the water to white and the air to diesel. The city's emergency response tightened around the scene. Coast Guard, NYPD, FDNY, EMS. The choreography widened from cockpit and cabin to piers and shore. Staging areas sprouted at ferry terminals. Ambulances idled hot. Hospitals readied warm rooms and IVs. Hypothermia has a clock. New York set about stopping it. On the ferry decks, the work was blunt and holy. Pull them up, pull them in, say, you're okay, even if no one could feel their feet. The cabin crew came off late. They always do. Shepherds are last. And the captain? He walked the aisle twice, making sure the airplane's metal belly was empty of humans before he stepped into the cold and onto a raft. He carried with him a manifest and a responsibility he would not lay down for many months. The airplane's belly began to settle. Photographers on shore captured a white fuselage with blue tail floating impossibly in a slate river, its nose slightly low, its flanks lined with people. The image would become an icon, not because it was miraculous in the supernatural sense, but because it was human competence at scale: aviation, maritime, medical, municipal, meeting chance and beating it by coordination. At the piers, the air was knives. Passengers came off the boats in waves, their faces red with cold, their hair beaded with Hudson spray, their bodies wrapped in whatever warmth could be found: blankets, borrowed coats, shock. Medics triaged quickly. Who needed heat now? Who could walk? Whose fingers were numb in a worrying way? Whose shivering hid something deeper? Names were matched to a manifest, faces to names, relief to the math of 155. Parents called spouses, business travelers called assistants, and then, quietly, their parents. The phrase, "we're okay," traveled across phone lines, breaking apart into tears or laughter, depending on the household that received it. Strangers who had stood on wings together exchanged looks only those two could ever fully parse. Media were already there. New York is that kind of town. Microphones sought adjectives, survivors offered nouns: cold, loud, bright, fast. Some later would find words that reached farther: gratitude, re-evaluation, grace. But on the pier, the vocabulary was primal. Coffee and soup were pressed into hands not quite ready to hold cups. The crew were checked last. That's how they would tell you it should be. Sullenberger made his first call home when procedure allowed. His voice controlled but edged with something even he would later call emotion. He had done the math: souls on board, souls accounted for, and knew that the outcome was a statistical outlier bordering on impossible. Yet he spoke like a man who had simply done his job, because the word hero sits uneasily on people who understand systems and probability. In emergency rooms, nurses slid IVs into veins, reluctant from cold. Doctors listened to lungs angry from aspirated river water. Heating blankets hummed. Doreen's leg was wrapped. Others had bruises in strange maps across their chests and hips, where belts had saved their internal organs. A few had cuts souvenired from bin latches and galley corners. The counting concluded. All 155 alive. That number would become the headline, the statistic that non-aviators would remember after the photographs faded. In the world of pilots and accident investigators, that number meant a chain of decisions had linked without breaking. Training decisions made years prior, checklists refined by people who would never meet these passengers, a captain's refusal to be rushed into the wrong miracle. Night slid down over the Hudson as the airplane, nose dipping, surrendered to the workboats and cranes that would take it ashore. The city, having flexed its emergency muscle, exhaled into the ordinary churn of a Thursday night. Inside apartments, televisions glowed with images of a wing crowded with people, and across the boroughs and the nation, some hands reached absent-mindedly to touch the shoulders of the people sitting next to them. Aviation writes its victories and its failures into manuals so that strangers can live tomorrow. The NTSB began to gather the artifacts immediately: data recorders, cockpit voice, engine pieces with feathers fused to fan blades. The story that the public told, Miracle, would become, in the hands of investigators, a stack of findings and safety recommendations. The things that build a safer sky. The flock was identified: large Canada geese, migratory heavy bodies that carry enough mass to ruin a turbine's day. Bird strike risks were re-examined. Airports revisited their wildlife management strategies with a new urgency. Airlines re-emphasized the human factors training that makes aviate, navigate, communicate more than a slogan. The dual-engine failure checklist that Skiles had lived through on paper and in muscle memory became the subject of don't change a thing praise and what-if debates. In hearing rooms and simulator bays, a question took on the gleam of controversy. Could the airplane have reached LaGuardia or Teterboro? On perfect simulators, the answer could be made to look like yes. If you turned back instantly, flawlessly, with no time spent diagnosing the problem like a human would. Introduce realistic reaction time, and the arcs intercepted rooftops and honesty. The board would eventually say as much. The ditching decision was appropriate. Precision in those words mattered to pilots who knew that second-guessing is cheap fuel for the wrong kind of courage. The crew sat for interviews that sifted emotion from fact. Sullenberger remained consistent. The river was the only runway physics would grant them. Skiles' even-keeled recounting of checklist discipline gave flight instructors a case study you could point to for the rest of a career. The flight attendants' testimonies, the cadence of brace, the door assessments under rushing water, the weight of deciding which exit to open, became a masterclass in what cabin crew actually do for a living, beyond pouring soda and diffusing impatience. Meanwhile, the human story did what human stories do: branched. Some passengers would speak publicly about what changed. Businesses started, divorces reconsidered, reconciliations attempted, bucket lists rewritten in ink. A few names entered the broader consciousness, telling their lessons in TED Talks and church basements alike. Many chose privacy, carrying the day quietly as a private sacrament. The airplane's carcass sat for a time as an object lesson, the torn metal along the aft fuselage a grim reminder of how marginal the margin had been. Tourists would one day stare at it behind museum glass and say, "I remember where I was," as if the aircraft were a reliquary for their own lives, paused and resumed on a winter afternoon. In classrooms where pilots learn, instructors began to tell the story not as miracle, but as method shaped by judgment. They underlined 3 moments. First, the early APU start. It kept electrical and hydraulic systems alive when engines went quiet, preserving control authority at the edges of the envelope. Second, the immediate sober refusal to be seduced by a runway that physics wouldn't allow. Third, the disciplined cockpit cabin choreography that turned 155 strangers into a team for 6 crucial minutes. Beyond aviation, leadership seminars seized on the narrative. Diagnose fast, decide once, communicate simply. "We're gonna be in the Hudson," a sentence that in another mouth might sound apocalyptic. In this one became a clarity that saved time and lives. It's not the poet's line that changes the world in a crisis, it is the accurate one. At kitchen tables, the story belonged to those who had boarded with grocery lists and itineraries. Parents told children why you listened to the safety briefing. Partners spoke aloud the words they texted on the descent and promised to say them earlier next time. A man who had felt the wing flex under his shoes remembered the ferry deckhands' faces and sent a letter he labored over to say thank you. Public ceremonies came as they do. Keys to cities, standing ovations at ballparks, book deals, movie sets. Some of it embarrassed the crew. Some of it they accepted as a chance to point eyes toward the people who rarely get statues: trainers, dispatchers, controllers, deckhands, EMTs. If the word hero had to land somewhere, they tried to spread its weight. The decision, the one sentence and the control inputs that followed, kept radiating forward in time. In future cockpits, pilots faced with their own bad minutes would remember this one and find steel in their voices. In future cabins, a flight attendant would lean into a brace command and feel a lineage at her back. In future boats, a captain would glance up and alter course because once he had altered course and pulled freezing people aboard and seen his city at its best. Years later, the Hudson glints the same in winter light. Ferries still cross, gulls still patrol, and geese still write their V's across the sky with ancient confidence. In museums, children press noses to plexiglass and read placards about a day their parents describe as if it were a story you tell to explain why people matter to each other. The airplane's torn tail tells its own plain gospel, that metal fails and humans sometimes do not. US Airways Flight 1549 is now a name that does a lot of work. It is shorthand for competence under pressure. for systems that hold when one person's decision aligns with 1,000 others made years earlier, for a city's generosity in a cold wind. It is also a private anniversary for 155 people and their circles, a reminder day, a gratitude day, a day when some go quiet and count. What the decision changed is not only that lives were saved, but how those lives would be lived. Some quit jobs that were eating them. Some went back to school. Some married the person they had been waiting to call. A few carried new anxieties and made friends with bridges and trains. Most carried a sharpened sense of what is trivial and what is not, and found that this sorting mechanism was the real miracle. Not the river, not the photographs, but the recalibration of an ordinary Thursday's stakes. For Sully and Skiles, for Donna, Sheila and Doreen, anniversaries brought microphones, and then, blessedly, fewer. They folded the day into their biographies with the same quiet competence that had animated it. The captain's decision would be taught and debated, praised and passed, but in the end, it remains what good decisions are: a faithful reading of reality in time to act, a winter afternoon, a flock in the wrong place, a cockpit where two professionals shared a language of checklists and trust, a cabin where three professionals forged strangers into a team with a cadence and a stare, a river that accepted a brief, improbable role as runway, and a city that turned its boats and hands toward the waterline. The end of the story is not that everyone lived. It is that for the rest of their lives, they would live differently, because one pilot chose the only runway left, and thousands of others met that choice with their own.